everybody, welcome to That's Cakeable. I'm Janine, and this week I'm going to show you how to make the bee's knees of cakes. It's a beode cake. So yep, I took the geode and a beehive, mashed them together and came up with the beode. You're not going to believe how simple this cake is. I hope you enjoyed this week's video. Okay, so to make this cake, I've decided for my center tiers to use cake dummies, but of course, you could use cake in their place. The center tier itself is made up of 2 dummies, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use some skewers to make sure that they're secured together and they don't shift around. I'm then going to attach my cake dummies to their setup boards with just a little bit of hot glue, so once again, they don't slide around. Cake dummies are a lot lighter than actual cake and have a tendency to just fly off the bench. Now with the center tier, the tall tier, before I go and cover the cake, I have to make an opening for where my beode is going to be. So I'm just going to take a small serrated knife and cut out a section of the foam. This can get super messy, where I want my beode to go. Once you've done that part, make sure you clean your bench thoroughly or you'll be finding little bits of styrofoam in all of your cake, or buttercream, or ganache, or fondant, or your hair. I'm then going to go ahead and roll out some white fondant and cover that cake dummy as I would cover a normal cake. When I get to the cutout section, I will cut a hole in my fondant so that I can lay that inside that hole. This part doesn't have to be perfect. I am going to fill in that hole a little bit later on with some royal icing, so it's not going to matter if there's a gap. Then with that middle tier, I'm going to grab my airbrush and cover it in black airbrush food colouring. Why don't you just cover your cake in black fondant, you may ask? Then you haven't watched enough of my videos. I avoid covering cakes in black or red fondant like the plague. If I can get away with covering it in a nice firm white fondant and then spraying it the colour I like, then I do it. And in this case, I can. With the bottom tier, I'm actually going to cover this in a patterned fondant. I got this really cool honeycomb texture mold, and I'll put a link in the description where I got mine, but I'm sure you can find them everywhere. I'm taking some gold coloured fondant and I'm just going to roll that out into my impression mat. Once I've got enough to cover both the top and the sides of that base tier, I'm going to start attaching it to the cake. To attach fondant to dummy cakes, I like to use clear piping gel. Okay, now I have the middle tier all done and the base tier all done. It's time to move on to the little beehive that's going on top. And the beehive is the only component of this cake that is actually cake. So to create the beehive, I took 4 1-inch high layers of 5-inch round chocolate cake. I stacked them all on top of each other on top of a 5-inch cake board that I'd cut a section out of for the hole in the beehive. For the final layer of the beehive, I put a 3-inch half sphere cake right on the top. This just helps with the eye a little bit more to be able to create that beehive shape. Now stay tuned because I do end up ditching the baseboard. This is probably the first time on one of my videos I've done this, maybe, I'm not sure. But I completely eyeballed it. I just carved a beehive shape. Now, as I got to the bottom, I wasn't happy with how much of that cake board was jutting out, so I did end up removing it and replacing it with a 3-inch board, not before I flipped my cake upside down just in my hand, and that's what's great about my chocolate mud cake. When it's chilled, it behaves. So flipping it upside down, like I said, I just rounded off the bottom a little bit to give it more of a beehive shape. I then popped it back onto my setup board, onto a 3-inch round cake board, and just kept carving away until I was happy with the shape. Once I was happy with that shape, I took a circle cutter and just cut out a little circle in the front for the door of the beehive, I guess, the opening. So you may have seen in the beginning, I cut a section out of the base layer of cake. That sort of didn't work for me as time went on. I was working it out as I went and I didn't like how it looked by the time I'd gotten to cut that opening. So in future, if I made a beehive cake, I wouldn't do that. I would just shape the beehive with the full cakes, then take the circle cutter and cut out that little hole in the front. Once that's done, it's time to take some dark chocolate ganache and give this baby a ganache coat. So you may need to use clean fingers or glove fingers to get in and smooth out that ganache in the opening of the beehive. But don't worry about it getting it like immaculately smooth because we're filling that with other stuff anyway. Right, we've got a ganache now. It's time to start creating a beehive look. Now I'm using modelling chocolate for this. You could use fondant if you wish, but I'm just taking some modelling chocolate and rolling it into a very long snake shape, keeping it quite thick. Then I'm going to run bands of that modelling chocolate around the outside of the beehive. I'm going to run another small band around the doorway of the opening of the beehive. Now that all the banding is done on the beehive, it's time to cover this baby. So with the same color fondant that I used to make the panels for the bottom tier, I'm going to use this, just roll it out and cover that beehive. Once it's covered, just make sure you go in with your hands and smooth out between all of those bands that you've made so that they're nice and defined underneath the fondant. Then once it is covered, I've taken my Dresden tool and I've just gone around and made some lines and marks in the side of the beehive to give it a bit more texture. Alright, so the honeycomb tier and the beehive tier are looking a little one-dimensional for me still. So I'm going to add some colour to them. I decided to airbrush both of these tiers with some ivory food colouring. Once they were both covered in ivory food colouring, I took a clean damp cloth and I wiped off all the excess airbrush on the cakes. What you're left with then is airbrush colour that has bled into all those details, and of course they stay because you're only wiping the excess off the surface. Just gives it a little more punch. Now before we go any further with more decorations, I'm going to assemble the cake on its board. Now, if you were doing this out of real cake, I'd suggest doing a structure with a center pole to hold this cake together. You can check out my video right here to see how I create the center pole structure to support taller cakes. Considering I'm using dummy cakes for this, to assemble this board, I'm just taking my base tier and attaching it to my board with a little bit of royal icing, making sure it's nice and centered. Once again, if you're using real cake, this is the point where you'd need to put support dowels in your base tier. You could use either wooden dowels or bubble tea straws, whatever you're comfortable with. On top of that, I place my next tier, which is my black beode tier. I'm also attaching that with a little bit of royal icing so it doesn't slide around, and making sure that that's nice and centered also. The next tier would follow the same rule if you're using all cake for these tiers. Make sure that that is supported with some internal dowels. Last but not least, I'm going to place my beehive cake on top of the beode cake. So I don't go out and buy fancy rock candy and stuff like that for my geodes, simply because it's an expensive practice. Instead, I make my own. So what I've done is taken some clear isomalt crystals, separated them into 2 silicone cups, and then melted them down. Once they're melted, in one of those cups, I'm adding a couple of drops of gold food coloring and stirring that in. And in the other cup, I'm adding some edible pearlescent gold crystals. I mix them all up and then I pour them out onto a silicone mat. Once they've dried, I break them all up in my hands and then use one of these wonderful meat tenderizers and just bang them and crush them and crush them. This job does get a little bit messy, but when you see those crystals in the end, it's very much worth it and costs a lot less than buying ready-made rock candy. Now to insert the crystals into the geode section and into the mouth of the beehive, I'm just using some royal icing that I've coloured a very light gold colour. If you need to go back in later and darken up areas, I just recommend using some airbrush colour or some watered down gel colour to paint the areas that are a bit too light. So yes, it's a very time-consuming process, but the effect is awesome in the end. I ended up actually switching out the royal icing to piping gel. I found that it held better and it didn't show any lightness, so I didn't need to go over and paint it later. Once I'd filled the geode cavity and the mouth of the beehive with crystals, I went around the edges of the geode cavity with some gold luster dust and alcohol. And then I took my brush and just sort of brushed over some of the crystals in both the beehive and in the geode with a little bit of gold also. So now I want to make it look like there's some droopy golden oozing honey coming out of the cake. To achieve this look, I've just taken some white chocolate ganache and I've heated it to thin it down a bit, popped it in a small squeeze bottle, and then just randomly squeezed some drips where I wanted them to be on the cake. Now we're going to paint these gold shortly, but they need to set up pretty well so that we don't shift the ganache as we paint them. Once the ganache is nice and set up, I'm going to take some gold luster dust and some alcohol and very carefully paint all those gold drips. Now on to the very last thing that we have to get done, and that's to make our little bees. I decided to keep it nice and simple, so to make these bees, I took some of the same coloured fondant that I'd used for the base tier and for the beehive and rolled that into sort of little ovals. I then took a small piece of black fondant and rolled that into a ball. I stuck the black ball onto the yellow oval and the bee's head and body was done. I used some black edible art paint to paint the black stripes onto the bee. And to make the wings, I rolled out a piece of white fondant and then used the top of a large round piping tip to cut out little circles. I pinched them at one end and then attached them just behind the head on the bee with a little bit of sugar glue. Voila, our little bees were done. To attach the bees to the cake, I just used a little bit of piping gel and popped them around sporadically. And that, my friends, is it. That's how you make this beautiful beode cake. Well guys, thank you so much for being with me for this week's beautiful tutorial. I hope you really enjoyed this week's tutorial. If you did, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell down the bottom so that you're informed every time I upload a new video. Well, I've shown you how it's done now, so you know what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to challenge you to go and get your cake on. I'll see you next time, guys. Bye.